Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about the Enlightenment, and in particular, the elements of Enlightenment thought. Now, all of these lectures are important, and I expect you to watch them and take good notes, study them. But this discussion of the elements of Enlightenment thought is particularly important, and that's because it's really going to lay the foundation for everything else we're going to talk about when it comes to the Enlightenment and the life of Benjamin Franklin. See, all of these things I'm going to discuss in terms of the elements of Enlightenment thought. Benjamin Franklin really never mentions them directly. At no point will he say, now I intend to discuss the importance of reason in life. He doesn't. You might ask, well, then why are we reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography? Well, he doesn't discuss them, but he does live them. We will see examples of all of these elements of Enlightenment thought in the life of Benjamin Franklin, in his thinking, in his beliefs, in his life's pursuits. They're there. But he's just not explicit about it. And so therefore, it's going to be really important that we understand these elements of Enlightenment thought and be able to recognize them. When he describes something happening in our life, we as readers need to be able to step back and realize like, oh yeah. I remember that fourth element of Enlightenment thought. And what Franklin's doing here seems to reflect a faith in that element. Okay, so this lecture is particularly important. Pay attention. Okay, like I said before, we're talking about we're going to be reading Franklin's autobiography. Franklin was one of the principal figures of the American Enlightenment and was influential not only on American thinkers but also deeply influential on European Enlightenment figures. Let's start with the definition. Okay, the Enlightenment was a transatlantic intellectual movement that had important consequences on social, political, and cultural life in the West. Okay, what do I mean by transatlantic? On both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and in what is now the United States and Canada for that matter. A transatlantic intellectual movement. As Franklin becomes better known, he will correspond with Europeans. Europeans will correspond with him. Thomas Jefferson, our third president of the United States, writer of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson would also be a very important figure in the Enlightenment. Same thing, he would correspond with people back and forth. So that's why I say transatlantic movement. And Enlightenment ideas were deeply influential, not simply in terms of philosophy. But Enlightenment ideas and values and insights would deeply shape society. Politics, culture, religion. The Enlightenment shaped life. You need to look no further than the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States to see how Enlightenment ideas will be embedded in the very structure of American society, its laws, its rules. We'll talk about some of that later on as this continues. Now, in terms of the time period, you can think of, as far as my class is concerned, the Enlightenment being bounded by the 1700s, the 18th century. That's when when people talk about the Age of Enlightenment, they're usually talking about the 1700s, the 18th century. So that's the period of time that we're going to be dealing with. What's going to follow for the rest of this is I'm going to go through specific ideas that were important to Enlightenment thinkers. Now, right off the bat, it's important to note, all of these elements of Enlightenment thought that I'm about to discuss, none of them were new to the 18th century. None of them were invented in the 18th century. Elements of all of them could be found going back all the way to the ancient world. Okay, so what's so special about the Enlightenment? What's so special about the 1700s? It was the way in which these ideas were being increasingly emphasized, increasingly used, increasingly depended upon. That's so important about the Enlightenment. It's a matter of emphasis. And the way also, and you'll see this fairly quickly as I start talking about these elements of Enlightenment thought, how the belief in one element of the Enlightenment could encourage you to believe in other elements of Enlightenment thought and how they get sort of balled together. Okay, but it's just really important to note that, none of these things were invented in the 1700s. These Enlightenment ideas, it's a matter of emphasis, and increased emphasis and reliance that we're going to be talking about. All right. And so during the Enlightenment, science takes on new importance as an area of knowledge. Reason takes on new importance. Increasingly, the universe seems more understandable, and that the world could better be controlled. Human nature starts to be viewed in more positive ways, at least among Enlightenment thinkers. There were growing beliefs, there were growing ideas of equality and liberty are starting to develop. The idea of secularism is starting to grow. These are all Enlightenment ideas. I'm going to talk more in detail in a second here, but I wanted to sort of give you a bit of an overview to let you know where we're going to be going. And like Puritanism, Enlightenment ideas are going to deeply impact the America that we live in. Okay. All right, so let's start with the first of these elements of Enlightenment thought. These are not in any particular order, right? They're just as they occurred to me as I sat down to write and think of these ideas. But the first one we're going to start with is science. Okay, again, science was not invented in the 1700s. However, science was taking on new authority. People were increasingly relying on science to understand the universe, understand the world, and to try and, very importantly, control the world. Science is the systematic study of the physical and natural world. Okay. And science was offering new ways of understanding and controlling the natural world as we're getting into the 1700s. Benjamin Franklin is an excellent example of the use of science and the benefits that this could pay off. If you guys know much about Benjamin Franklin at all, one of the things you might know about him is the story of Franklin going out in a lightning storm with a kite with a piece of metal attached to it, trying to conduct lightning to hit the metal hanging from his kite. This is a story a lot of us heard going all the way back into childhood about Benjamin Franklin. And almost because a lot of us heard this very early on, and it almost makes it seem like a childish story. But Franklin's insights into electricity and his formulations of electrical theory were not only important theoretically, but also had really important practical applications to the 18th century. What Franklin was trying to do in that kite experiment was to prove that lightning was actually made of electricity. That was still being debated at the time. And Franklin believed if lightning could be conducted to that metal, that would prove, in fact, that it was electricity. And he did, and this seemed to prove it, and it became broadly accepted at that point that lightning was electricity. Now, one of the important practical inventions was that shortly after doing this kite experiment, Franklin invented the lightning rod. Look, before the invention of the lightning rod, lightning was really terrifying to people. Lightning would come down, hit structures, hit buildings, hit homes, light them on fire. And at a time where buildings and homes were made of extremely flammable materials, and fire suppression, like fire departments, were very rudimentary and rather ineffective. Lightning was terrifying. When a lightning storm hit, you had to be worried. Like, is my house gonna blow up? Is my house gonna light on fire? Is this lightning gonna set my town on fire? Well, the invention of the lightning rod, which was, a large piece of tapered metal that you could put on top of buildings, what it ironically did was encouraged lightning to come down and strike, but only strike the lightning rod, and that would diffuse the power. And rather than hitting the rest of the building that was flammable, lightning would hit this large piece of metal and then safely be dispersed. This was a really important practical invention that saved tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives over the centuries, that saved unknown tolls of structures and towns and cities because of this invention. This was a way in which we see the systematic study of nature, science, being used to solve a very practical problem that improved the lives of people. And that was Benjamin Franklin. And this was happening all over during the 18th century. Again, people had used science before. People were systematically studying the physical and natural world before the 18th century. It was just happening more coming into the 1700s. And it was greatly accelerating during this century. And people were starting to turn to science more and more to do things like what Franklin did. Franklin's theories on electrical theory would also be important. Anybody who studied electrical theory learns very early on through analogies between electricity and water. Electrical current flows in certain ways, similar to how water flows. Water, it can be pushed through pressure. Electrical voltage gets pushed through current, sort of like that. Water can be slowed and resisted. Electricity could be slowed and resisted. One of Franklin's great insights is to take this terrifying natural phenomenon of lightning and electricity and to come up with this theory of, well, actually we can better control electricity if we think of it in ways similar to the ways we already control water. This was an important insight. This became it's still the way we learn electrical theory today, by comparing it to water. You show me a book on electrical theory, I'll show you a book that has a picture of a water spigot, one with a bigger opening with water dripping slowly out of it, and then one with a really small one and water shooting out with a lot of force, and that you're learning about pressure in electrical voltage, right? It was Franklin that first sort of thought of that. So also in these theoretical realms, okay? So one of the things we're going to talk about a lot is science and the Enlightenment, okay? Franklin was a scientist. Of the many things, as we'll talk about, Franklin was many things. But one of the things he was a scientist, particularly a practical scientist, but nonetheless a scientist. So the first element in our list that we associate with Enlightenment thought is science. That's something we associate. Yeah. Second element that we talk a lot about with the Enlightenment, and that's reason. Enlightenment thinkers such as Franklin placed a lot of emphasis on the idea of reason. And there's almost two components to this when we talk about reason. Okay, reason is the power of the human mind to comprehend the world in orderly ways. Now, reason and science are not the same thing. Right? Reason you could just do all in your head. You could systematically try and understand something in your head. Science is more systematic. Science requires developing a hypothesis and then using observation and measurement and experimentation to test that hypothesis. If everything works like your hypothesis planned, good, you've figured it out. If it doesn't, you might need to modify your hypothesis or maybe even completely abandon it and try and come up with something new. Reason is deeply involved with science, but they're not the same thing. Reason doesn't require experimentation and things like that. But it's this power that the human mind, that humans possess, the ability to comprehend in orderly ways. Again, this was not some idea that was invented in the 1800s. Okay, you go back to the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, they loved the idea of reason. Hey, our old Puritan friends, they also loved reason. You might be surprised by that. The Puritans loved reason. They believed reason was a power God gave us to help us better understand His will. The problem from the Puritan perspective with reason was that it was relatively weak. Man's nature was very sinful. Man's nature was to be somewhat weak. And so man's reason was often overwhelmed by his sinful nature. I'll give you an example of this in a lecture or two, exploring this idea more. But make no mistake about it, the Puritans loved reason. They believed this, like, that's how you understood the Bible. That's how you understood God's will. It was this power of reason. So it's not that it was new, but just like science, reason was taking on greater authority as we get into the 1700s. And like I started to say before, there's almost two elements of this. Okay, one part of it is the growing belief that the universe operates according to reasonable principles. Take, for example, Sir Isaac Newton and his ideas, his laws that he starts to develop. Just think of gravity as the most simple of these. Gravity is a law of the universe that you simply can't get around, right? If I pick up, let me see if I got anything around. Oh, here's our our Lockridge book. Okay, I want you to listen. Okay, hear that? I just dropped it on the ground. Okay. Every time I drop something like a book, it's going to hit the ground. Every single time. Not most of the time, not almost always, not 99.99% of the time, always. Unless acted upon by another force. Really strong wind could come up and, keep it maybe above there for a little while. But this is a law. It's going to happen. Yes, we have airplanes, but airplanes are designed to overcome the effects of gravity. Okay? If you had an airplane and suddenly you took gravity away, which that plane was invented for, that plane wouldn't function like it was. So yes, we can overcome gravity, but we do so by applying things like force to make that happen, right? During the 18th century, there was this growing idea that the universe operates according to reasonable principles, things we can understand. Okay, volcanoes explode for specific reasons. Throughout earlier human history, people often interpreted volcanoes exploding because the gods were angry. So stereotypically, therefore, we got to find a few virgins and throw them in there to appease the gods. By the time we're getting to the 1700s, now there's this increasing attempt to, what geologic processes are happening that are making that explode? There's some reasonable principles going on that's making that happen. Let's try to understand that. Okay, and so that's the first half of this, that the universe operates according to reasonable principles. And then the other part is that, the human mind has the capacity to use reason to understand these reasonable principles of the universe. Not only does the universe operate according to reasonable principles, but the human mind has the capability of understanding these things. There's kind of two sides to this, and without the other, it doesn't make sense. If the universe simply operated by whim or chaos, and there were no predictable rules, then we wouldn't be able to understand the universe. If the universe operated according to reasonable principles, but man did not possess reason enough to understand them, then we couldn't understand it. So there's two sides to this growing Enlightenment faith and reason. That one, A, the universe operates according to reasonable principles, and two, B, that we can understand this. All right. So reason is going to be important. And by the way, and you can also already see how science and reason are not the same thing. But faith in one leads you to have a faith in the other, that they're related. They're not the same thing, but they're related. We're going to see lots of examples of Benjamin Franklin's faith in reason. Of all the elements of Enlightenment thought, it's probably the easiest one to pick up on in Franklin's autobiography. Okay. Number 3, a more positive view of human nature. In our last unit on the Puritans, we spent a lot of time talking about the Puritans' negative view of human nature, right? The Puritans believed that man was evil. And like we talked about before, that is pretty standard Christian theology. That's pretty much Christianity 101, this belief that man is evil. But what I told you at the time, what sort of differentiated the Puritans from other Christians was just how profoundly evil they believed man was. Everybody was evil. All people are evil. The worst thing you've heard any human being do, that potential was within all of us as far as the Puritans were concerned. One of the ideas we associate with the Enlightenment is an increasingly positive view of human nature, or at least a more neutral view of human nature. Compared to the Puritans, this is a more positive view of human nature. But I'm not necessarily saying that all Enlightenment thinkers believed human nature was essentially positive. Just compared to Christian ideas of human nature, Enlightenment thinkers tended to view them as more positive. Let's talk about where this idea in particular starts to grow. This picture of this gentleman I have here for you is the English philosopher John Locke. Locke was a very important thinker for the Enlightenment. Yeah. One of the things Locke was interested in was how we know what we seem to know. And what Locke argued was that rather than being born with an essential nature, that's ultimately what Christians and Puritans believe. Man's born with an essential nature. That essential nature is man is born evil. Instead, Locke argued, no, we're not born evil. We are born neutral. We're neither good nor bad when we're born. Tabula rasa is the Latin term for this. Blank slate. That's what tabula rasa means. It means blank slate. That's what Locke argued humans are born as. We're born as blank slates, like a notebook in which nothing has been written into it. There is no written nature, determined nature yet. Our nature comes from our lived experience. It comes from our environment. It comes from our learning. As we grow, as we learn, our nature starts to develop. So, Locke believed environment was very important. You take a neutral born child who's neither good or bad at birth. You place that child into a good home with good parents, good structure, send that child to good schools. There's a better chance that that child will grow up in a positive way. Okay, not a guarantee, but there's a much better chance at that. Okay, take that same neutrally born child, place that child into an uncaring home, chaotic environment, bad schools, a bad neighborhood. There's a better chance that child is going to grow up with problems. That wasn't written in stone. That wasn't ordained in the beginning. All right? Rather, we are a blank slate. We become what we become through experience. Okay? This is a much more optimistic point of view about human nature compared to the Puritan belief that man is evil. This is a much more positive view. It's also a view that encourages a belief in a more profound possibility of change on a societal level. This doesn't just pertain to the individual, but think of society on a broader level. If people are truly born neutral, if we can create the right kind of institutions in society, the right kind of homes, the right kinds of neighborhoods, the right kinds of schools, the right kinds of society, people can be much better. Society could be much better. You can see where this kind of thinking might lead to the possibility of imagining of a revolution like the American Revolution, in which you could reimagine a society that's qualitatively different than earlier societies, where you vest more power, more trust in people, because you can imagine that people are better. through earlier human history, one of the reasons you gave power to the king was because people are knuckleheads, because people can't be trusted, because people are evil. So therefore, the best shot we got is a wise king. Hopefully we'll get a wise king, and that wise king will make decisions for the rest of us. But a more positive view of human nature might afford the possibility of trusting people themselves more. I'm not saying the entire American Revolution stems from this singular idea. It doesn't. There are lots of other things that go into it. We'll talk about the American Revolution later on. But it's part of the puzzle in understanding why the Americans thought they could transform their society, why they thought they could live without a king. Okay, there's more to talk about, but this is a good place to stop this lecture. I'll stop here. I'll come back. We'll finish the rest of the list in the next lecture, because I don't want this one to go too long. We still have a lot to talk about. Okay, that's it for right now. I'll see you guys soon.